Welcome to Awakenings with Mike Adams, where in 10 minutes you're invited to wake up on an important topic about health usually, but sometimes your wealth, as is the case in this episode about the IRS. And here I'd like to awaken you to the little-known truth that the IRS doesn't need your tax dollars to fund the operations of the government. This is a myth, and I'll explain why. Most people think that the government couldn't operate unless we all sent in our tax money. Personal taxes and corporate taxes, they think, pay for the government's operations. And we all have to go through this stressful exercise every April to calculate our tax burden and send a check to the IRS or request a refund if they've been taking your money out of every paycheck. And this is a huge burden, a huge loss of productivity to the entire nation in order to do this. But people have been told that this is necessary to fund the government operations, that if we didn't send this money to the IRS, roads and schools and bridges wouldn't get built, right? That's what we're all told, but it's completely false. And here's why. Do you remember the Wall Street bailouts from 2008 and onward? The federal government, when it wanted to, it simply created $1 trillion out of nothing. It created $1 trillion. Well, I should say, the Fed created the $1 trillion first, and then it loaned it to the Treasury, creating $1 trillion in public debt to the Fed, a private corporation, the Federal Reserve I'm referring to here. So $1 trillion was created, and then the government used that $1 trillion to bail out all the banks in Wall Street so that there wouldn't be a systemic, catastrophic collapse of the entire global banking system. That's what they were stopping with creating that money and putting it into the pockets of the banks. How hard was it for the government to do that? It took no effort whatsoever. It was a line item entry in a computer at the Federal Reserve and then a matching line item entry at the Treasury. Then they had $1 trillion. And they transferred it to the banks, and then they solved the collapse problem. The banks did not collapse, and then they say they saved the world. They saved the global banking empire from catastrophic collapse. Well, if the government can create $1 trillion effortlessly with really no costs associated with it, I'll talk about monetary debasement in a minute, they could also do that as a replacement for the tax code. You see, taxes generate only about $2.8 trillion for the federal government. That's personal taxes and corporate taxes combined. Altogether, they only generate $2.8 trillion, at least in the year 2013. For 2014, it'll be about $3 trillion. For 2015, about $3.3 trillion, according to estimates. Well, we already know the government can create $1 trillion with no effort overnight. So can they create $2.8 trillion or $3 trillion? Of course they can. If they wanted to, they could simply create $3 trillion, shut down the IRS, have no tax code whatsoever, let every person in America keep 100% of their paychecks. Well, minus Social Security, I suppose. But at least you wouldn't have federal tax, income tax taken out. Everybody could take home more money, and the government could simply create $3 trillion a year with a simple entry that would then fund the entire federal government and everything in it. It would build all the schools, all the roads, all the bridges. And that's not even where most of the money goes, by the way. It would fund the Department of Defense. It would fund Social Security. It would fund Medicare. That's where the real money is spent, on war, disease, and death in the United States. Most of the federal spending goes into those programs. Now imagine the economic abundance that would take place if every worker in America got to keep nearly all of their paycheck. All they would have to do is pay state taxes, and in many states there are no state income taxes. People could keep more of their money. What would they do with it? They would spend it. They would go out and spend it at local retailers. They would spend it in online shopping. They would spend it at restaurants and movie theaters, buying clothes and cars and homes. Unemployment would plummet. The economy would be rescued from its current downward spiral of job loss and unemployment and poverty. If people could keep more of their money, America would be stronger economically. And we wouldn't have to waste all those hours and all that effort preparing taxes, which is very, very complicated. And if you make a simple mistake, you can be considered a criminal for it or get penalized for it by the IRS. We don't need this entire system, it turns out, of paying taxes and collecting taxes and having everybody go into a cycle of fear and stress once a year, every April, when they're trying to figure out how much they owe the government. The government doesn't need your money to function. So why does the IRS exist? It exists as a form of social control because legislators can use the IRS to shape the tax code to reward or punish different groups that they want to reward and punish. It is a system of control, of manipulation, not a system of funding the government. And that's why the IRS will never be removed voluntarily. It will never go away because it's a system of keeping people down, of the government putting people under their thumb and saying you have to conform in this way or that way. And if you don't, you're going to be audited and possibly arrested. Remember the IRS politically motivated audits that took place with all the conservative nonprofits over the last few years. The IRS is a political weapon or tool, you might say, might be a better term. It's not a revenue collection system to fund the government. It's a tool of social control. Now you might say, well, if the government just created $3 trillion, wouldn't that lead to price inflation? Wouldn't that lead to a debasement of the currency? Well, here's the answer. The government's creating over $1 trillion in money every year anyway. It's called quantitative easing. The Federal Reserve is pumping this money into banks and into the economy every single month. Right now, tens of billions of dollars a month. Right now. Over $1 trillion a year right now to prevent systemic collapse. So the government is already doing it. They're already slowly eroding the value of your dollars. Now, how can they get away with that without collapsing the money supply? The answer is that the M2 money supply is so large, and there are so many dollars used around the world by other nations, that the M2 money supply is enormous. As a result of that, introducing a few $1 trillion into the money supply doesn't debase the very large amount of circulating money, the M2 money supply, because it's so huge. If there were only a few dollars in circulation, then obviously introducing $1 trillion would vastly and rapidly debase the currency. But because there are so many trillions of dollars in global circulation, it doesn't have that effect. So the government can quite literally create $3 trillion a year in money to replace the money collected by the IRS and still not have a currency debasement crisis. They could do it if they wanted to. So what should you do about it? Well, sadly, there's not that much you can do about it because the system is enforced under penalty of law. They'll throw you in prison if you don't agree to send money to the IRS so that they can pretend to fund the federal government. Not much is going to change until people wake up and realize how economies really work and how money really works. And sadly, it's a complex topic beyond the grasp of most voters. So people don't understand where money comes from, how it's created, how debt accumulates. Many people actually think that the national debt has been reduced under President Obama because that's what he promised as a campaign promise. Actually, it's exploded under Obama. Under his administration, there's been more debt added to the United States of America than in all the other presidential administrations combined through the history of the entire country. And as long as the masses don't understand finance, economies, and debt, they will continue to be conned and scammed by governments that steal from them even when it's not necessary to fund their operations. Thanks for listening to Awakenings. This is Mike Adams. Check out more episodes at naturalnews.com.